Thank you for listening to the John Calvin podcast. For early access, bonus episodes, and a range of community benefits, sign up at johncalvinpod.com/support. That's johncalvinpod.com/support.
Imagine you want to make it as a TikTok influencer and you had like $200 in your bank account and you used all of it to buy a camera and to buy a nice outfit to make a video, and then your video was a failure. You know, that's how Calvin must have felt.
Well, I'm super excited to have with me today Sam Ha. Sam is Theological Librarian at Calvin Theological Seminary, where he is also a PhD candidate like me. Hooray! But he's curator of the Meter Center, and he's also an ordained pastor in the Presbyterian Church of Korea. And he has a real passion for teaching systematic theology in a way that helps everyday Christians to thrive and flourish. So, Sam, thank you so much for coming on the John Calvin podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Just to get us going, would you mind telling us a bit about your story and maybe how you ended up where you are now, and a bit about how your interest in Calvin developed?
Okay, so that will need a little bit of life story as a whole. I'll try to keep it short. I was born in Korea, and my father was a Presbyterian minister who was a strong Calvinist. And he was a church planter, so I grew up in a really small church. And his teaching was really Calvinistic, but his practice was quite Pentecostal. So I had that interesting breed of like two things put together. So and then I was growing up, like he would often tell me stuff about like Westminster Confessions and John Calvin, etc. But I didn't really like understand those things fully. And then my father was a big fan of Francis Schaeffer, and we actually went to the library in England when I was like 2 or 3. So I don't remember any of that at all. But he really enjoyed spending time in England. So when I was in my last year of high school, he was like, "Why don't you study in England?" I was like, "Sure, why not?" So I ended up going there. So I went to London School of Theology. There, I really began to understand like Calvinism and the Reformed tradition. The first book was J.I. Packer's Knowing God. Reading, and I was like blown away. Like, wow, I didn't know that knowing God entailed so many different things. And I thought what I needed to do was to love Jesus and to pray every day and, you know, do my quiet time. But like, wow, this is so much more than that. And then I was taught by Tony Lane that, you know, of course, he taught me about Calvin and Calvinism, and that was really the beginning of it. So that's how I started. And then I went back to Korea to do my MDiv at Korean Theological Seminary. That place is really like, it's a reformed seminary, but at the same time, it had a pretty Kuyperian tone to it as well. As I was finishing off my MDiv, my professors were like, "Hey, Sam, you gotta like study more and like become a proper like academic." So I came to Calvin Seminary. When I first came to Calvin, I didn't know that I was going to focus on John Calvin, although the name kind of gives it away. So to go back a bit, when I was at London School of Theology, I really appreciated Graham McFarland's classes, and he taught a lot of modern theology. So I really read a lot of Karl Barth, Pannenberg, Moltmann, Rana, and stuff, which I really enjoyed. So I thought about like doing modern theology at Calvin Theological Seminary, but then I started working at the Meter Center that I'm going to talk about later. And then I started as a student worker, and then I was so fascinated by Calvin and his theology. So that's how I really ended up. I use the word ended up because I had never planned to do this, but God led me in such a way that I am where I am.
Really interesting to hear. Yeah, do tell us more about this role you've got as the curator of the Meter Center. What is that about?
So the Meter Center is a research institution or research institute for Calvin studies, Reformation, and Calvinism. What we do, we do a lot of things. One of the most important things that we do is to actually have a special collection. So we collect every single thing that is published throughout the world if it pertains to Calvin. primarily, but we also collect stuff about the Reformation, Calvinism, and sometimes Neo-Calvinism as well. So a lot of people come to the Meter Center to write their like article, books, dissertations. We have a lot of dissertations, and some people might think of some of the stuff that we have as obscure because they're really hard to get. But a lot of the researchers, they're like, "Oh, I really needed it," and you were like one of the two places that had it. So they would travel all the way to Michigan just to look at that one single book. So related to that, we offer fellowships to visiting scholars. So we have visitors to stay in Grand Rapids for a month or two, which you could apply for if you want to, of course. Yeah, and then they stay here. We do that. We hold a lot of lectures, webinars, and events. We do a lot of like sort of lay people, non-professional events as well. In fact, we do Calvin's birthday every year. He was born in July, so we do something in July, telling people about John Calvin. So there's that. My director, her name is Dr. Corinne Mark. She does a lot of publication and a lot of teaching around the world. So that's what we do as well. And one thing that I want to really highlight is this thing called Calvin bibliography. So we publish this every year through Calvin Theological Journal. And we share every book, every article, every dissertation that has to do with John Calvin. And we've been doing that for like more than 2 decades now. So a lot of Calvin scholars begin their research by looking at that to know what's going on in Calvin studies.
Okay, and it's called Calvin Bibliography.
That's correct.
Great. I'll check it out. Presumably is Meter a person, a theologian? Should I know who he is or she? Who is he? Just for the ignorant among us.
So he was a professor at Calvin's university. When he was teaching here, that is, it was called Calvin College. And he thought, hey, we're called Calvin. We really need a special collection that is dedicated to Calvin and Calvinism research. So that's why we got the name. And different people came in and did their job, but he was really the one who started it. So we are keeping the name. He actually has a book on Calvinism, which is really good. Kind of like it belongs to the older work now, but I think it is still relevant. If you read his work, you will be pleasantly surprised that there was such an interesting book written quite a while ago and in Grand Rapids. So we still carry the name.
So you said you've got some interesting historical documents and resources there. And anything in particular that has stood out to you that might be of interest to someone with, a Calvin nerd?
I just don't know where to begin. I would suggest to every listener that if you want a proper tour of the Meter Center, you are more than welcome to email me or just turn up. We have a lot of visitors who just turn up. We just have so many stuff by John Calvin. I would put it this way. We have pretty much everything that was published in Calvin's lifetime. My favorites, there are so many, but
Sounds incredible.
if the Meter Center catches a fire, I really hope that doesn't happen. I think I will grab this one first. It's Calvin's first ever publication, his commentary on De Clementia, Seneca's De Clementia, published in 1532.
Wow.
And so, we have that one, and we are one of the few places in the entire world that have it. And can I tell the story of that book? I'm sure there are a lot of people who know about the book, but...
Please, yeah.
Yeah, so this was the book that he published before he became the one that we know. And as you can tell by the title, it's not necessarily a theological one. He was a budding humanist, and he was trying to, this is like his debut album, right? If he was a YouTuber, this is his first video, and he self-published it. So he used his own money, he invested in it, and then, we have letters of him saying that, can you please use this as your textbook so that I don't starve to death, kind of thing. So so every time I show this book to younger students, like Calvin University students who are in their early 20s, I usually say that, imagine you want to make it as a TikTok influencer and you had like $200 in your bank account, and you used all of it to buy a camera and to buy a nice outfit to make a video, and then your video was a failure. And then that's how Calvin must have felt.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out, especially because some of my research is trying to unpick the degree to which that early Stoic influencing Calvin continues in his theology of the affections or not. And I'm leaning towards saying not, but that it's still there, but in a more Augustinian mode, as it were. It's an area that whole area is interesting, and seeing an actual copy of the book would be absolutely incredible. I've got to come out there at some point now. So let's come back to you for a minute though, Sam, because obviously you've published an insanely impressive amount, especially given that you're still finishing your doctorate as well. I was really impressed by just the sheer amount you've been able to do. But what are you working on right now?
I am trying to focus on my dissertation so that I can finish off my degree. But there are some things. There is a book chapter that I've been asked to write about Calvin and ecumenism and how he wanted to keep the unity of the church, right? He was in that moment when Lutherans and Reformed theologians were arguing, like, how can we achieve unity without sacrificing our conscience? So that's something that I am kind of working on. But at the same time, I am also interested in expanding my horizon a little bit by looking at Neo-Calvinism as well. How does Calvin relate to Neo-Calvinism? And I admire a lot of the Neo-Calvinist theologians out there, and I really admire their work. But I think these Neo-Calvinists were called Neo-Calvinists for a reason, and I feel like not a lot of attention has been given to that. A lot of people are they were trying to reinterpret Calvin. But what about not reinterpretation? What about interpretation of Calvin? I want to know what is Calvin's contribution to the birth of interesting theological movements. So that's something that I'm working on as well.
So are you in the camp that would see sort of continuity or discontinuity between Calvin and the Neo-Calvinists?
That's a good one. I want to say that the Neo-Calvinists wanted more continuity than a lot of people now believe. But at the same time, so that's what their aim was, right? I think that's what their aim was. But whether they succeeded or not is still, it needs to be, studied more.
Yeah. And I think it's because my doctorate's in systematic theology. I think yours is as well, right?
I'm kind of trying to do both history and systematic, but do carry on.
Okay, mixture of both. Great. Part of the reason I ask it is just because I'm certainly wanting to do something, for want of a better phrase, constructive with Calvin. But there's absolutely a school of Calvin scholarship that seems to shut any attempt to do that down, partly because so I'm thinking things like Muller's very influential book, The Unaccommodated Calvin, and things like that, where obviously Calvin's work is getting, at the time that was published, accommodated to all sorts of things. But I suppose the downside of that is it just ends up shutting down doing anything today if you take it too far. But so I'm very much in. It sounds like I'm in a similar place to you with wanting to be historically informed and not to use Calvin in a way that would be completely, where you would just not be able to trace any continuity at all. But saying there are things he can say today, and it's valuable to try and get those things and make those things explicit.
I want to say that I agree with that 100%. I think that needs to be emphasized. And I actually was corresponding with Tony Lane a few months ago about that question. I feel like I asked him, a lot of people are doing history of Christianity, and a lot of people are doing systematic theology. But fewer people are doing historical theology, where they're doing that constructive thing, right? What did they say? But also, how do we do our own theology by listening to them? And so in that regard, I feel like a lot of people either simply want to listen to Calvin and say, either we just leave it there, oh, that's what he said, end of, or we have to follow everything that he said. And I'm these are two extremes that I don't want to do. And there are people who are oh, Calvin is irrelevant now. And oh, that's too extreme as well. So I'm trying to find kind of the fourth way, right? Listening to the past, but at the same time, like critiquing him. So I agree completely. So I really look forward to your input in that in the near future.
Well, yes, and yours too. It sounds really exciting, and I'm glad that there's other people out there who see that in Calvin still today as well. So I can see here that you've published quite a bit in the areas of Calvin's pneumatology. Could you maybe say a bit more about that? What is it about Calvin's pneumatology that you've found interesting?
Firstly, I think I am kind of, if I could go back a bit, like I told you about my background of like being Pentecostal, and like my father was like always emphasizing the role of the Holy Spirit. So I think there is a personal element there. But when I look at the historical, like all the scholars who looked at Calvin, many of them were like interested in Calvin's soteriology, Calvin's Christology, Calvin's doctrine of God. I do know that there are people who have done Calvin's pneumatology, but certainly not as much as the other aspects of the theology. So in that regard, I feel like, hey, this is something that needs to be done. And I'm not saying that just to keep the balance, but as I read Calvin's theology myself, I see a lot of, like, I think he is very interested in the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. A lot of people divide his institutes into, he was doing a commentary on Apostles' Creed, which is fair enough to some extent. But if you look at book 1 and 2, which are about God the Father, the Creator, and God the Son, Redeemer, but in both of these books, Calvin refers to the Holy Spirit again and again and again and again. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. So in that regard, I think Calvin himself emphasized it. Therefore, I am finding it interesting. But also, I find like conversations. I'm really interested in global Christianity as well. And if you look at the global South and their theology, a lot of the stronger movements are Pentecostal movements. And I want there to be a dialogue between sort of traditional theology, right? I'm not saying the Reformed theology is necessarily the traditional theology, but like I want to be the person who could make the dialogue happen between the two movements, as it were.
You mentioned global Christianity and the influence and those two influences in your own life from your father as well. Would you mind saying, like, I can see here you've published on the impact of the Reformed faith on the Korean Peninsula, which I imagine might be new to some of our listeners, because people know Calvin's massive influence in the States and Europe, but it might be less known, maybe. I don't know. Would you mind saying a little bit about that as well?
Of course. One big thing that I have to mention first is that there were a lot of Scottish, American, and Canadian missionaries in the entire world in the 19th and 20th centuries. That was like a trendy thing. I don't want to say it was a trendy thing, but like there was a trend for sure. And that's how like India had a lot of Presbyterian missionaries. Korea had a lot. They did try to evangelize China and Japan, but not as successfully. So to speak about, because my main interest is really the Korean Peninsula in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and there were a lot of Presbyterian missionaries there in the Korean Peninsula. In fact, some of the first missionaries were Presbyterians, and they had a strong Calvinist theological education background. So they had a huge impact on that. I did a plenary lecture on that subject at the recent Calvin Studies Society colloquium that took place in Grand Rapids too. And that takes place every 2 years, and every so often they come back to Grand Rapids. So I was there, and I did a plenary lecture. But my argument there was actually the opposite of what I said before, was that people assume that all the theologians who were in Korea to begin with were strong Calvinists. But if you look at their own writings, that's not as clear cut. It's much more nuanced than that. So I'm kind of going back there. But the Presbyterian churches in Korea are really, really big. And I would say the majority of Protestants are Presbyterians and Calvinists. So in that regard, the Calvinist tradition had a huge impact on the Korean church. And if you look at a lot of the international students studying in the States, they go to a lot of the Reformed seminaries like Calvin Theological Seminary or Westminster Theological Seminary. The trend is changing a bit now, but even recently, I think a lot of the people are trying to study in the Reformed tradition.
Interesting. And how is the trend changing? People are staying in South Korea to study, are they? Or do you see it changing in a different way?
It's a question that I am still exploring myself, but I have noticed that, as you know, the American Christianity is going through a culture war, and which is kind of a repeated story, right? If you remember the old Princeton and new Princeton, and Westminster versus Princeton and all that. So it's kind of happening again in a way. And some of the reformed places are not as conservative as these Korean students want them to be. So they are actually going to a lot of the Baptist seminaries, like Southern Baptist, Southwestern, or Midwestern Baptist, where professors are much more explicit about their conservative position on important issues.
I saw one of your other pieces that intrigued me was it's called Necessary and Sweet, the Rhetoric of Persecution Among the Missionaries in Korea During the Japanese Colonization. This is probably connected to what you were just saying about your interest in that area, but could you maybe say a bit more about that for people who might not be familiar with the history?
Yeah, I find, in general, I find rhetoric of suffering and consolation really, really interesting. I think it's a key theme in my mind. And, in the early 20th century, the Japanese Empire colonized and occupied the Korean Peninsula. So Korea as a country ceased to exist at that point. And what is really interesting is that the Japanese authorities wanted to shut down the church, even though the church never really explicitly went against the empire. They never said that, we can't be Christians and be part of the empire. They were trying to be nice, but the authorities were really afraid that the church might do something. And their fear was actually right. The churches were highly involved in a lot of the independence movement. A lot of the leaders of these movements were Christians. They didn't really see this as their explicitly Christian duty, but they definitely saw it as something that Christians must do because it's part of loving their neighbor. It's not like it's not a Christian nationalism thing. It's not like, let's bring back, the national glory by moving these, making these Japanese leave the country. But it was more that we are suffering so much, we need to help our brothers and sisters in Christ so that they can survive and stuff. Later on, the Japanese authorities actually tried to force Korean Christians to worship the emperor, which then became a religious problem. So a lot of my ancestors became martyrs by saying no to the emperor worship. So that particular presentation, I talked about what are the specific ways the missionaries and theologians in Korea used to convince their fellow brothers and sisters to persevere in the midst of such suffering.
It sounds really interesting. I can see why you would find Calvin's context generative for that, because the sort of burnings at the stake and him having to flee France because of how dangerous it is. I guess there's probably a lot of experiential continuities in that, maybe. So you were doing this talk recently on about global Christianity and Calvin and global Christianity. What was the essence of what you were saying there? Then was that about what Calvin contributes to global Christianity, or something different?
So my purpose of that lecture was the scholarly consensus is that the first missionaries to Korea were strong Calvinists. Therefore, they taught this Calvinist theology. That is why we have so many Korean Presbyterians now. My pushback was that, they did have that theological education. Yes, they were Reformed scholars and pastors and theologians, but maybe not as strong. To give you a little more than that, I would say that this particular missionary theologian named Reynolds, he was a very influential figure in establishing the first Reformed seminary in Korea. He had this article that introduces a Calvin and Calvinism. And there he says Calvin was a great guy. His theology was fantastic. His, Institute of the Christian Religion was a masterpiece that he rarely had to change because in the beginning it was really good. And then he goes on to say, but there are a lot of the things that I don't agree with him. And I was like, what? This is the guy that everybody believes to be a strong Calvinist, and the things that he disagrees about are really crucial stuff, like soteriological stuff, like atonement issues and predestination. So my conclusion was that how do you say someone is a Calvinist or not? And my conclusion is that you have to define Calvinism first, which is a very difficult thing, as you know, right? And like you mentioned Mullah before, and Dr. Mullah is famous for saying that you should never use Calvinism because you should really use Reformed tradition, which I agree with. Anyway, so my point was that if you think Calvinism needs to entail like specific views on atonement and predestination, then some of the first missionaries in Korea were not really Calvinists. But if your definition is broader than that, sure, the missionaries were Calvinists.
I wonder, what was it then that made him be identified as being Calvinist then?
Yeah, he talks a lot about like Bible's authority.
Okay.
He talks about, it's really interesting because the way he describes Calvinism as a good thing. So he says like all these soteriological stuff are actually toxic, which is shocking. So you should stay away from it. And the good things about Calvinism, according to him, are like how to connect doctrine with life and how to encourage families to function properly in God, etc., which sounds incredibly like neo-Calvinism. So I'm wondering, like, did he read any Bavinck or Kuyper, which would have been not that unlikely, but not that likely either. So yeah, at this point, I'm being speculative, but it sounds incredibly like neo-Calvinism.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I wonder whether it was his reading of Calvin's piety as well, maybe. That obviously piety today has a slightly negative, goody two-shoes vibe to it, doesn't it? But obviously for Calvin, it had it's almost this sort of fusing of knowledge and experience. And so I could see why someone might identify something as being a Calvinist approach in that, maybe. I don't know. I'm completely speculating. I don't know that context at all, but yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, but there are some like reasonable speculations there too, to say, and it's not like, I mean, he was the theologian in Korea at the time, but it's not like, he did his PhD at Cambridge or Oxford or Harvard or Yale or any place like that. So he was an academic, but he wasn't like, he was more of a missionary than an academic, because he was a missionary. And I think because of the context, he wrote this article for lay people and pastors, not other fellow academics. So in that regard, the context is like, oh, don't worry about these super intellectual questions that are so confusing. Let's think about the practical stuff. That's possible. That's one of the reasonable ways to think about it. Another thing is that there were different like there were Methodist missionaries, there were Baptist missionaries, and they had different views on soteriology. And Reynolds was on a lot of the ecumenical committees. So one of my speculations is that he really wanted to have the unity of the church, have one, like Canada in his day, they had one church, right? And he wanted, like, although he wasn't Canadian, he wanted, I think, something like that. So there is a place like one of the committee documents actually says that let's worry less about like Methodist, Calvinist soteriology, but let's think about how to make this church one church in this small country. So there's that, but he never says it explicitly, so there's no way of knowing.
I'm definitely going to go away and read him anyway. It sounds super interesting. Are there translations of his stuff in English?
Not that I know of.
Oh, okay, maybe not then. but it's just fascinating to learn about anyway. But yeah, thanks for explaining. Yeah, so you were saying that you think Calvin is a good person to talk about in relation to suffering and persecution. Slightly different theme here, but a slightly older paper you gave was on John Calvin and his Consolation of Theology. for the refugees. Did that touch on similar themes as well?
Yeah, that's right. I actually have an article that's going to come out later on that specific topic. So I'm actually connecting Calvin and missionaries in Korea. So connecting our previous conversation to the next.
Great. Which journal's that in?
That Church History and Religious Culture, CHRC. There I talk about there I'm doing kind of two things. One way, on the one hand, I am explaining how Calvin viewed theology itself. What is theology for? Why do we do theology? Why do people read theology? And one of the reasons why, he says, is consolation of the suffering. And the other part of the paper is to talk about okay, what are the doctrines specifically that he uses to comfort the persecuted believers? And I think it's interesting how even in his beginning of his career, I think he makes that pretty clear that he sees consolation as a key element of theology.
I wonder whether, I spoke recently with John Balzac as well, and it made me laugh because he was saying invariably when people, because he teaches at a secular university, when people encounter Calvin, undergraduates, they usually hate him intensely. But I wonder whether one way to change that is actually to teach about how he brought comfort to believers who are suffering and the consolation he brought to the refugees that came. And because he suffered enormously himself, Calvin, didn't he? And I think I was reading the other day about I think it was someone advising him to go for a vigorous horse ride to dislodge a kidney stone. And I just thought, wow, okay, there's someone here who's very, very familiar with suffering. And therefore, I don't know, maybe that would augment some of the initial repulsion people might feel towards Calvin.
Yeah, I mean, even if you look at his, you don't even have to look at his theology to find him less irritating. His life is such a sad life, right? He started his career as a humanist, and like I said, the first book failed miserably. And then, he was trying to, there are so many letters where he talks about, I wanted this life, but that God moved me away from it. He wanted a quiet life, and he ended up in Geneva, and then he got kicked out of Geneva, and then he got, invited back to Geneva. And people think about maybe the last 10 years of his life, he had some autonomy, but before that he was doing what other people ask him to do, and his whole life is full of suffering and misery. I feel like if somebody asked me, do you want to live like John Calvin? I'm like, well, probably not. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciate John Balsarac's work. I read his book. I mean, he's written so much on John Calvin, but I really liked his book on Calvin's work on minor prophets. And that was one of the key inspirations for me to look at John Calvin that way, because those lectures on the minor prophets, John Calvin, is a huge, and that historical context in which he did those lectures, he was really mindful of these French refugees in Geneva who want to go back to France to be missionaries there. And he needs to teach them about consolation of theology. Otherwise, they're not going to survive, and their congregations are not going to survive. Mm-hmm. So I think that's such a huge contribution to Calvin's studies by John. And it's a good work by John Calvin that everybody should read, I think.
Yes, I agree. So one thing that you wrote about, Sam, that I thought was really interesting was sort of bringing Calvin into discussion about the COVID pandemic, talking about his understanding of physical proximity. So you were saying the people we physically worship with, for Calvin, have a great impact on our spiritual life. I found that really interesting, but would you mind just unpacking that a bit more?
So basically what Calvin is saying is that you will be influenced by the people around you, especially in liturgical settings. So he's saying that choose the community that you worship with properly. And he sometimes says that simply hanging out with people who have a different lifestyle is harmful, but then that's really obvious, right? If you hang out with like wicked, like that's like in the Bible through and through. But Calvin uses that liturgical language a lot, like watch out for the people that you worship with. To be exact, a lot of these conversations were had to do with his anti-Nicodemism that I'm sure a lot of the people know. So he's basically saying that there were Protestants living in Catholic regions saying that, oh, I'm a Protestant, but I am in a Catholic country, therefore I cannot worship God properly the way I should. I'm participating in mass because I have to save my life, etc. But Calvin was like, no, you cannot say that you worship God with your soul, but not with your body. So there is that element. But I kind of go beyond that and say it's not just about God and me and giving the honor that is due to him, but it's also like, if you continue to worship with people who are worshiping God wrong and living a life that is not ideal to God's standards, then you will be living like them as well. And he connects it with soteriology as well. So if you continue to worship with them, you will be influenced and you will begin to believe in God in a wrong way and serve him in the wrong way. Therefore, that's going to lead you to destruction. And he's asking, do you want that? So he's essentially asking that we need to worship with people who are on the path to salvation, which is, at first I was really surprised by it because, everybody knows that, Calvin was a good old predestination guy. And if we are predestined to be saved, does where we worship matter? But in these practical letters, he's kind of saying yes. I'm like, I don't know, like how to, I haven't really been able to like see how these two things work together. But at this point, he's like, yeah, we are saved when we are saved by God. But on the other hand, if you put yourself in that bad position, you're going to ruin yourself.
And what are the implications of that? You talk about sacramental and developmental implications. What do you see that as? What were those for you?
In some places he's specific, but in general he's not that specific. So it's really broad. So that's why I said physical proximity. If he had like specific issues, that I would have spoken more about them. But it's just that it's as simple as that. If you are physically near to people who are worshiping with you, then you will become like them.
Where do you see, or where would you like to see Calvin studies going in the future? Or where do you hope it would go?
That's a great question. I think the current trend is, as I have been writing and presenting about Calvin as an exile, that's still an interesting thing. I want to see more of that. On the one hand, I want to monopolize it, but I shouldn't be greedy, and I want to invite other people to do an interesting thing. I want to kind of double down on that and say, hey, can we read Calvin in a more post-Christian way? Can we read him in a more post-colonial way? Not that he belonged to a colonial age in any way whatsoever, but I find him interesting because, like you mentioned, he had to leave France. He was living as a foreigner in Geneva, and I think that gives him a different light in terms of colonialism. How his missional attempts for France, how does that translate into like the way we understand missions now? Or even like, I have a lot of colleagues who are working on Dutch colonialism in the 17th century, and how did they understand the gospel is different from the way Calvin understood the gospel. So how does one's historical context influence the way we understand the gospel and how we evangelize? That sort of thing is fascinating to me. I want to see more of that. And I want to go back to what we talked about before, like, people either dismissing Calvin or praising him too much. I want more people like, let's listen to him and see how we can use him to do our own theology for today.
It's really good. Yeah, thank you, Sam. Question I quite like to ask, particularly when I'm speaking to Calvin scholars, is maybe if you had to pick one thing you most appreciate about Calvin's theology today. I like Torrance's idea that Calvin recovered theology's status in many ways as a science and set it on more coherent foundations. I know the Torrance interpretation of Calvin has its problems, but for me, that's where I land on it. But what about you? What do you most appreciate about John Calvin's theology?
That's a fantastic question that I've never really thought about. Wow, that's a great question. I want to agree with you, but I want to expand on it. I think his attempt to do a really comprehensive and coherent theology is great, but he made that theology so accessible and pastoral. Not just his style, but also content wise, right? And if there is a letter written by Calvin between the first institute and the second one, and he's writing to his friends saying that I am already beginning to translate my first little book into French. And in those days, writing in your own mother tongue is not a taboo, but it's kind of, would any serious scholar do that? Why would you spend your time doing that? You should probably stuff in Latin. But he was from the get-go, I'm going to make it available for lay people, non-professionals. And if you read his French institutes, it's really different. Sometimes he would put one entire paragraph to explain something difficult, or he would take out something that is unnecessarily difficult. And I think that what you said, plus making its form and content accessible to people. And this is what Dr. Muller said at some point. He was in some ways, Calvin became popular and hero of a really strong movement, not because he was so profound a thinker, but because he was easier to read. In some ways, I want to push back a bit and say, but he was a great thinker, right? I think he was a great thinker. But at the same time, I agree with him because, yes, I think he made it so much easier than a lot of the people in his time. And that's why his legacy is still appreciated.
Yeah, again, it shows the sort of that he's not just he's not this sort of logician, as it were, that detached from pastoral concerns and polemical concerns and all of that. Sam, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. It's been really great to chat with you. And I've already, learned a lot more about Calvin and his impact than I knew before. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the John Calvin podcast. For early access, bonus episodes, and a range of community benefits, sign up at johncalvinpod.com/support. That's johncalvinpod.com/support.